When America made cluster bombs rain down on Arab civilians, America is complicit in and responsible for Israel's violations of international law. When America continues to back Israel even as it launches unwarranted wars of aggression against Lebanon and Gaza, American aid makes Israel both rash and provocative. What is American aid to Israel? The United States has provided aid to Israel for many decades, both in the form of developmental aid and more importantly in the form of military assistance to increase Israel's military aid to its neighbors with provision of high-tech weapons like the SJII stealth fighter. This aid is substantial and amounts to $3 billion annually. Our policy is simple. We will immediately cease all loans, grants, and weapon sales to from America to Israel. However, we will continue to retain full diplomatic ties with Israel and engage in talks to ensure stability in the Middle East. We will also refrain from vetoing Security Council resolutions that condemn Israel for violations of international law. We clarify that aid is taken as a given today by provocative Israel, but withdrawing aid allows us to use aid as a carrot in the future, and proposition is open to the possibility of giving aid to a vastly different Israel in the future, an Israel that perhaps will make overtures towards peace and withdraw to pre-1967 borders. So we will be elaborating on 4 effects of our policy. I will talk about how we stop Israeli provocation in the short run and how we serve the interests of America as a promoter of peace. Darren will be talking about how we empower moderates and pacifists in Israel and improve Arab-Israeli relations. And the team will show you how America can no longer condone Israel's provocative actions and must withdraw aid to restore America's image and promote peace in the Middle East. So let's move on to my first point of substantive on how we stop short-run conflict provocation. They recognize that the original purpose of American aid was to avoid a scenario where Israel, as a Jewish nation surrounded by hostile Arab states, we wiped off the face of the land by the hostile Arab invasion. Today, this policy is clearly removed for several reasons. Israel has one of the most powerful and well-equipped militaries in the world, supported by conscription and a burgeoning economy that's the 27th highest GDP per capita in the world. Israel is weaning itself off dependence on America for military material necessary for self-defense, by producing its own tanks like the Merkava and missiles like the Hebron. Israel is a nuclear power. No sane Arab nation is going to risk attacking the nuclear power. So far from being vulnerable to aggression, Israel is powerful enough to launch wars against its neighbors, as it did by invading Lebanon in 2006 and the Gaza Strip in 2009. Clearly, Israel can survive and preserve its existence as a nation, even if American aid is withdrawn from it. No thank you, sir. But what withdrawal of aid does for Israel is that it extends its aggression for 2 reasons. Firstly, Israel needs advanced military equipment provided only by the United States, such as satellite communication networks and advanced fighter planes, which effectively extend its military reach, project power, and spread out beyond its borders. And this equipment, crucially, is not manufactured by local Israeli companies that focus on the tanks and guns Israel needs for self-defense. There's a fundamental difference between technology needed for self-defense and technology needed to extend Israel's reach beyond its borders and strike out at its own neighbors. For example, American fighter bombers like the F-15 are an example of technology that Israel doesn't need to defend borders, but the technology that Israel needs to bomb civilians in Lebanon. Even if Israel might still be able to invade its neighbors without this high-tech equipment, withdrawing aid means you will now let the overwhelming military aid be necessary to make such a war painless and quick. Secondly, and more importantly, the guarantee of US support for all of Israel's actions empowers Israel by assuring Israel that Israel always has the backing of the world's last remaining superpower. It makes Israeli commanders more willing to launch into risky and rash military action, knowing that the US will be there to save the day should something go wrong. It makes Israel more rash because the US veto in the Security Council has consistently shielded Israel from international condemnation for its illegal actions. Ending aid makes the Israeli military think twice before sending its military out on grand adventures overseas, especially because I've proven that the military's striking capability has been greatly reduced by our policy. In conclusion, withdrawal of US aid removes the political will and the military capability that Israel needs to launch provocative strikes against its neighbors that derail the Arab-Israeli peace process, increase tension in the region, and threaten regional stability in one of the most dangerous and unstable regions in the world. Yes, sir.
Sir, the last 50 years, Israel has been waged in 5 wars, and the last one in 1973, Israel nearly lost. What do you say about that?
Sir, Israel is now a nuclear power. Israel now is the largest, one of the world's most powerful militaries in the world. Israel has won every single one of the 5 wars we talked about, and the Israel of today is now able to launch wars against its own neighbors. deal with that opposition. So now let me show you why we stand Israeli aggression. Let's talk about why we serve the interests of the United States as a promoter of peace. The national community has long encouraged peaceful means to promote a two-state solution. The Arab-Israeli conflict, America in particular, has hosted the Annapolis Peace Conference and the signing of the Oslo Accords. However, Israel continues to act in bad faith, rejecting diplomatic means to solve the conflict by continuing to settle in Palestine and launching wars of aggression. So by continuing to give aid to Israel, America tacitly condones Israel's attempts to undermine America's own efforts to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute in accordance with the international consensus on the issue. Worse, when Israel commits flagrant violations of international law by launching wars of aggression and using disproportionate force against civilians, America also becomes complicit in violating international law. Israel launched 100,000 cluster bombs in civilian areas when it invaded Lebanon in 2006. The United States is and was a major supplier of Israeli cluster munitions and therefore became responsible for over 200 civilian casualties caused by cluster bombs used in Lebanon. As a responsible member of the international community, America cannot continue to abet such violations. America knows that its weapons are being used to violate international law, and we challenge opposition right now to tell us why America should continue with such a policy of military assistance. Additionally, American aid to Israel is the largest recruiting poster for terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda to rally support for extremism and radicalism. Terrorist organizations appeal to Arabs by portraying America as actively assisting Israel in killing their Lebanese and Palestinian brothers, fueling the thirst for revenge against the West. And this is exacerbated when America seems to be standing on the same side as Israel in what radicals call a colonialist crusade against Islam. So American aid allows terrorists to recast the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. There's a clear need to end US aid to Israel, and this has three important effects. Firstly, it allows the US to become a responsible state that acts in accordance with international law and condemns violators like Israel, because withdrawal of aid is the harshest possible condemnation the US can give to Israel. This gives the US the moral and political capital to take action in urgent crises like Sudan and Iran, where progress has been hampered by accusations of American hypocrisy. Second, it damages terrorist movements against America, because America demonstrates with concrete action this time that it's willing to back up all its empty talk about a two-state solution with concrete action against Israel and fulfill all of President Obama's broken promises about change in the Middle East. Thirdly, it allows the US to act as an honest broker in the Palestinian-Arab conflict and finally reach a resolution on the issue, because now it gains the trust and support of both the Arab world, Palestine, and Israel. Ending aid to Israel is the last step to complete the sea change in American policy heralded by Obama, a foreign policy approach that emphasizes diplomacy and denounces aggressive states like Israel. So withdrawal of aid essentially is the right thing to do, because we don't want to support violators of international law. It restores American image and it resists Israeli belligerence. Go to start the proposition.
Now, using the proposition's suggestion that America is a strong protector of peace, we as the opposition say that without America's aid to Israel, what would happen is that Israel will be severely threatened by all its neighboring Arab hostile countries. And what will happen is that by America not aiding Israel, it will not lead to peace, but only more disturbance, more wars, more instability. Now, before I move on, I have 2 points of contention with the proposition today. Firstly, that of the policy, and secondly, that of the first speaker's success. Now, the policy inculcates that military aid would stop, but diplomatic relations would remain. But we as opposition ask that diplomatic relations being still there does not actually benefit Israel anymore. Because what we see as the opposition, who believe in the status quo, is actually that the fact that they need the US aid to be in Israel to help protect Israel and also that the superpower is still there, so that no Arab countries can easily take their liberties against Israel. Now, on their substance. Now, the first speaker came out to say that the American equipment is not needed in Israel because Israel has its own equipment. But what they fail to see is that American equipment more importantly, helps the Israeli troops to not only keep the people, Arab forces out of the country, but also more so to push them away from Israel borders to make sure that no Arab country would actually threaten Israel. And like my second speaker in his POI has said, that despite what they suggested about advanced Israeli equipment, in the Yom Kippur War, we saw that the Egyptians came nearly 50 kilometers near Israel, which threatened Israel severely. And now, so today we as opposition, we advocate status quo. Why do we advocate status quo? We see that Israel is the only functioning and long-standing democracy in the Middle East. And with the current Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring, we see that a stoppage of American aid will actually result in destabilizing this region because Israel is intensely disliked by the majority of the Arab world, as I will show you later on in my substantive video. Now, let us hear a little short background on Israel and the USA and why their relationship is so important and why Israel has to remain there as with the US support. Now, they have three links. Firstly, the historical link, the principal link, and the economic link. Now, historically, we know that there was a Zionist movement in the USA where Jewish lobbyists asked that a Jewish state be formed. And this started in World War II. Now, as a result of this, in the principal point, we see that from the beginning of Woodrow Wilson's presidency in the United States from the World War II, we see that he has been strongly supporting the presence of the Jewish state. Now, finally, economically, why Israel is so important? Because in Israel, because of the stability of Israel, thanks to the United Nations, the United States aid, we see that because of this, they can obtain what it requires. Now, I, as the first speaker, will show you what happens when you stop aid to Israel, and my second speaker, Daniel, he will be talking about the repercussions of abandoning democracy in principle. Now, what we see, let's look at what happened if US aid was actually stopped. Now, US aid is by far Israel's strongest ally in terms of military, in terms of economy. Now, it is safe to claim that it's because of American aid that Israel still exists in its current strong condition, in form, and in power today.
Adam.
Yes, sir.
Tell me which Arabian country is going to attack a nuclear power.
Oh, sir, I was just getting there. Now, let me tell you that Iran has actually declared that it wants to completely annihilate Israel. It wants to annihilate Israel. And even Qatar, who is considered one of the more liberal Arab states, what happens when the people in Qatar obtain war maps? They take the pair of scissors and they cut Israel out of the map. Now, from here we can see that Israel is actually intensely disliked, not just disliked, it's intensely disliked from its surrounding countries. So what we see is that by withdrawing American aid, we actually leave Israel in an extremely vulnerable position against the whole region, the whole Arab region, who actually regrets Israel's existence. Now, there are two possibilities of what could actually happen. Firstly, one of the possibilities is that these Arab countries, who are now emboldened by the United States withdrawal of aid from Israel, that these countries now have a greater incentive to actually go ahead and attack Israel. Or even maybe not attack, but start to try and push Israel's borders back to what they were previously, before Israel started to expand itself.
Point of information.
Yes, sir.
Ma'am, with regards to the whole notion of returning to the 1967 borders, we believe that the Arabian states know fully well diplomacy is more likely to achieve this method and pull out confrontational force. That has not worked for the past few decades of the century.
Well, sir, clearly we see that diplomacy is not the way because the Arab nations have already voiced their discontent with Israel and the fact that they do not actually recognize Israel as a sovereign state in the Middle East. So what we see is that they do not believe in trying to attain diplomatic relations. They more often often-in-law who actually wants to obliterate Israel by using their force and to rid them of the map. Now, for example, due to President Mubarak's falling, Egypt is now no longer bound to respect the previous agreements that they had with the United States with regards to Israel and their state sovereignty. So now that Mubarak is gone, Egypt can easily just go and attack Israel because now there's nothing that they need to respect. And furthermore, Israel will start to get defensive because now that the lack of the United Nations, you'll remember the incident in 1948 where 5 Arab states, including Iraq, pledged an all-out war on them. And the second possibility is that even if Arab countries do not actually go ahead and attack Israel, what could happen? Israel will still, because it is the only state in the Arab world that is not recognized by the Arab world. So it will actually feel extremely vulnerable, threatened, because no one actually recognizes and supports its existence around there. So furthermore, Israel is a belligerent nation. It will not hesitate to use force to protect its own survival. And we could see that in the 1967 preemptive war against these Arab nations. And this was even when the US was the ally. What will happen now if US is no longer the ally? Yes, like the proposition suggested, they might use the nuclear powers. So here we see that without the US aid, there's a greater potential for full-out war. And this is going to be a more devastating war than ever before. So what do you want?
The problem with side opposition is that they live in the past. They live in the Middle Eastern region in which Israel didn't have nuclear weapons and therefore Middle Eastern countries didn't mind attacking. They live in the past in which a belligerent Israel engaged in all sorts of provocative wars, but which also happens in the present. A present our side wants to avoid. We want a better Israel, a more responsible Israel, and a Middle East which is stable, and that's why we would withdraw US aid from Israel. 2 contentions. 1. Will Israel be threatened without United States aid? 2. Does the US need aid to live up to its ties, or can it not principally condone Israel's actions? 1. Will Israel be threatened without US aid? So the very fundamental problem with the characterization of the Middle East is this whole idea that the entire Arab world hates Israel. First and foremost, that isn't true. Israel has made progress, headway, in constructing ties with Arab nations in recent times. We see peace deals with Egypt and Jordan, no thank you, and don't believe them when they tell you that Egypt no longer needs to respect its peace deals. The military is still in power, and that's the same military that signed those peace deals. So first and foremost, we disagree that the entire Arab world is anti-Israel. But even if it were, the question is, will anybody take the first step to attack Israel? Here they told us that we've seen numerous examples of wars with Israel. Sure, all happened before Israel developed nuclear weapons. Why? Because the moment you have nuclear weapons, you have the ability to wipe out your aggressors without even a military engagement. It's true that in the past it was easy to engage in conflicts with Israel, maybe even push them all the way 50 kilometers from Israel's borders, but it isn't possible in the present when Israel can wipe it out with a single press of a button. The nuclear weapon is the most effective deterrent from action, and that's why Israel is no longer under threat from its neighbors. Secondly, they talk about the preemptive wars that Israel has launched in its neighbors. And that's precisely a reason why other countries aren't going to be attacking Israel. Because they recognize that Israel is both capable and dedicated to its defense, it's even going the additional step to attack other countries. Although we think that's a bad thing, we also think it's the absolute incentive for these countries to not engage with Israel. And on all these counts, my first speaker's entire line of analysis about how Israel doesn't need the United States to survive were ignored. So will Israel be threatened without US aid? No, we don't think so. Second contention, does the US need aid to live up to its ties, or should it principally not condone Israel's actions? They talk about the historical ties between the US and Israel, and they mention the Jewish lobby here. But the fact of the matter is, the Jewish lobby isn't as powerful as they think, and isn't as pro-Israeli. The very fact that President Obama dares, no thank you sir, to suggest a restoration of the 1967 borders demonstrates that the Jewish lobby isn't a powerful factor in this decision-making calculus. Now secondly, they talk about the principle of supporting democracies. I'm sorry, we support democracies, I'll give you in a moment, which act in a responsible fashion, not democracies which are belligerent, which are aggressive, which are detrimental to peace. Yes.
So, contrary to your belief, the lobbyists in America were actually businessmen. And you know why they're concerned? Because every year they spend $1 million to help Israel.
Alright, we don't think that helps a good thing. We don't think you should make money by selling weapons to a country which uses those weapons to attack citizens in another country who weren't even, United States enemies in the first place. That's aggression that isn't something we condone. And for these reasons, even if the Jewish lobby comprised of businessmen who have businesses in Israel, we would cut out that business. So then we asked them, what about my first speaker's point of contention, which was entirely ignored by side oppositions? Clement talked to you about how the United States cannot tacitly condone the acts of Israel. How the United States cannot assist Israel in its aggressive wars against other countries. All of this analysis went unrebutted by side opposition. And we think that the principal ties which the US has with Israel are nothing compared to the dedication which the United States should have to democracy and to peace. And for these reasons, we would support the withdrawal of aid from Israel. Moving on here to my point of substantive analysis on disempowering radicals and empowering moderates. My argument's thesis is that withdrawing aid sways popular voter sentiment away from radicals toward moderates. So let's ask the first question. Who is the average Israeli man? We think the average Israeli doesn't appreciate being shelled by Hamas every other day. The fact of the matter is, the average person doesn't like his government's belligerence when this belligerence begets reprisal. The second thing we have to say about the average Israeli is that as a member of a people who suffered one of the worst genocides in history, he doesn't want to be accused of the same atrocities that were committed against the Jewish people in the past. And that's an important characterization, which we'll get back to later. The problem is that's only the average Israeli man. The radical does exist within Israel. Who are these radicals? We see them in parties such as the third largest party in Israel, the Israeli Beteinu. They are people who think that expansion of territory through conquest is acceptable. They are people who want belligerent assaults against other countries. They are people who think it's perfectly justifiable to swallow Palestine whole. These are the radicals who exist within Israel. Their support base are similar radicals who choose to build settlements in Palestinian territory, despite the territory not being theirs. Before I move on, yes ma'am?
Well, sir, both the average Israeli and the radical Israeli will both need US aid because US aid is either going to defend it in the case of the average or actually help the radical Israeli.
Again, side opposition ignores our analysis that US aid doesn't change the capacity of Israel to self-defense. Even if we withdraw all US aid from Israel, it doesn't change Israel's nuclear complement. So unless they can prove that US aid itself keeps that nuclear program functioning, they haven't proven that Israel can't survive without US aid. Moving back to my substantive argument, the fact of the matter is, the radicals in Israel affect politics. They use tacit United States approval to sway popular sentiment into believing two things. Firstly, that their policies of aggressive expansionism keep the average Israeli safe, by telling the average man that the United States supports these actions. Secondly, they sway the average voter into believing that it's morally acceptable for these policies to happen because the United States, the bastion of human rights and democracy, is supporting their actions. That's how the radicals affect politics in Israel. Our policy succeeds in disempowering them. And removing the tacit support that the radical has from the United States was sending a powerful message to the people of Israel that behavior isn't condoned by the international community. We don't condone aggressive expansion, we don't condone the conquest of territory that isn't yours, and we don't condone forcing people in Palestine into living in conditions which aren't hospitable. So for this reason, our policy empowers moderates, because we affirm the need to respect international law, and we turn citizens away from parties which are perceived to have chased the United States away. Because these are parties that are now seen as the public enemy. They removed US assistance to the country, which is a long-standing historical fact. And for this reason, we empower the moderates who are seen as the cooler heads who will prevail. The success of our policy is that it contributes to Middle Eastern stability. The moderate parties believe in negotiation, in truly pursuing a two-state solution, and that's good for Arab-Israeli relations, because that opens the doors for us to communicate with the Palestinians, with the United States as the moderator, which is also something my first speaker talked about, and side opposition has an education. So what is our side proven? We've demonstrated that Israel can stand on its own, that whatever changes the US has in regard to its aid in Israel doesn't affect its nuclear program, which is a key deterrent from other countries from attacking. And we've proven that the United States cannot stand by a country which continues to act against the principles of international relations against the principles which our side is proud to stand for.
So let's understand basically, what is the consequence of US aid going to Israel? According to the proposition, apparently ending US aid to Israel will make Israel better as a nation. Why? Because apparently without American support, they won't feel safe enough to commit or undergo this policy of aggressive expansion. And apparently because of that, there'll be much more peace in the region. That's essentially what they're standing for. But when we see on the contrary, the presence of America in Israel, the idea that America is supporting Israel makes Israelis feel safe, essentially. And then when America makes Israel feel safe, essentially Israel won't feel the need to aggressively expand, because there's no need to aggressively expand when you're safe and secure behind your own borders and America is protecting you. And essentially because of this, US aid in Israel can never stop, because once US aid leaves Israel, what's going to happen is that Israel's going to feel unsafe without it. So, and they'll try and wage preemptive wars to try and ensure peace, form a bit of peace within its own borders, and ensure that without American aid, it can still survive. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we therefore see that US aid in Israel won't actually end conflicts, will make Israel less secure, and when you're less secure, they'll try to forcefully ensure its own peace by attacking its own neighbors and ensuring that by preemptively attacking them, these neighbors cannot fight back. So let's talk about essentially what the proposition talked about. Essentially, the first speaker said that stopping US aid to Israel will end conflicts. So, and apparently, my first speaker already told them that the Arab nations around Israel completely hate Israel and they want to attack them as soon as possible. However, the second speaker came up and said, nuclear energy is in Israel. As a result of that, people won't attack them. But let's look at this carefully, ladies and gentlemen. Nuclear power has been developing in Israel since the 1960s. And between 1960s and now, there have been a large number of wars that were between Arab states and Israel, showing that Arab states still don't mind attacking Israel, even though there's this supposed nuclear deterrent. And furthermore, more recently in 2007, we saw the Hamas from the Gaza Strip fired rockets at Israeli territory. What happens, ladies and gentlemen? They don't mind attacking Israel. This nuclear deterrent doesn't exist. Because ultimately, these Arab states are willing to die in order to invade Israel. They're willing to die to ensure that their rightful territory is re-established. And as a result of that, ladies and gentlemen, they don't mind attacking Israel even though they have a small nuclear deterrent. And ultimately, Israel won't want to attack, won't want to use nuclear weaponry. Because ultimately, it will make other countries feel unsafe, and they might find they might support the Arab soldiers. So ultimately, this will mean more support, more opposition against Israel, opposition with nuclear power by the principle of mutually assured destruction, because they'll be afraid that Israel might turn to nuclear weaponry on them as well. Because if Israel uses nuclear weaponry, they'll be showing the entire world that, hey, I've got nuclear weaponry, I don't mind using it. So why not? So what's the problem with me throwing it every single country that sees me as a threat? So essentially what's going to happen is that more opposition to Israel is going to sprout up, and ultimately this nuclear deterrent won't actually be as great as we talked about. And ladies and gentlemen, in 1964, 1969, 1973, Israel was still attacked. And in 1973, Israel nearly lost to these Arabs, even though, number one, they had American support, and number two, they had a nuclear deterrent. So ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen is that without this American support, Israel will be the far weakest state than it's in. And in 1973, if it nearly fell already, what's going to happen is that there'll be a much higher chance of Israel falling. And that's highly detrimental on a political level, on a global level, as I'll be elaborating later in my substantive point. So, ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at this carefully. They say that Israel is going through all these human rights violations. But let's look at Arab nations around Israel. Are they necessarily so perfect either? We say that Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are guilty even more atrocious crimes, essentially, ladies and gentlemen. And we saw in Syria brutally suppressing protesters to its regime. We saw how there are so many other human rights violations in these countries. And if they say Israel isn't a country that should be supported because of all these human rights violations, ultimately we say even more human rights violations are going to occur if these governments actually take over Israel in the first place. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, if they want even more evidence of Arab aggression towards Israel, let's look at this example. President Ahmadinejad of President Ahmadinejad openly announced that Israel will be wiped off the map recently. And this is also entailing the idea of this nuclear deterrence in Israel, ladies and gentlemen. So, no president openly says that Israel should be wiped off the map if they are scared of Israel's nuclear deterrence. So ultimately, we see this concern and doesn't actually exist in reality. So let's move on to my substantive point for today on how ending the US aid to Israel will abandon democracy in principle and ultimately global ramifications and the US's other relations and other countries as a result. Now, if America withdraws aid from Israel, other Arab countries, mainly Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, will attack Israel because they have deep-rooted aggression towards it, they have deep-rooted hatred towards Israel. So ultimately what's going to happen is that a huge amount of countries are going to be attacking Israel, and without US support, we doubt that Israel can actually hold on. Yes, sir.
The difference between abuses in Israel and abuses in Syria is that America is responsible for the former. Why should America let weapons used to kill civilians?
On the contrary, sir. Okay, fine. Sir, we say that American weaponry being used in Israel to carry out human rights violations. But, ladies and gentlemen, human rights violations are human rights violations all the same. And as a result, if we want to look at this from a better perspective, we're looking at how much human rights violations will take place in Israel if the motion goes through. And whether or not it's by America or not by America is irrelevant to the idea that Arab nations will still take over Israel and its human rights violations will occur on a greater scale, because even right now, with all these superior technology, they still manage to inflict so much human rights violations all the same. So we don't think that point stands in today's debate. But furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, if America abandons Israel, Israel will fall to the point and let's not forget that America has supplied $15 billion a year to Israel for the past years, and this has been increasing over time. And again, in the 1973 war, Israel nearly lost, and this was with American aid. And without American aid, we don't think too highly of the chances of Israel surviving. And we see that letting hostile nations take the land by force will give the wrong impression to other democracies that America also supports. And we look at this in the Vietnam War, where North Vietnam overwhelmed South Vietnam because of US abandonment. And the result was that Laos and Cambodia was attacked subsequently, even though they were democracies, they were somewhat supported by the US, but they still managed to invade because they were confident that the US wouldn't support them. And this gives the wrong image. And on a global level, given the increase in ties that America has with other democracies around the world, we say this will give the public perception that the US will abandon its vulnerable allies when they are in hostile position, that in the hour of need, US will abandon its allies. And we say that given that Israel gets the most consistent support from the US out of all democracies, this will send the wrong message to other democracies which are not as supported by the USA. And ultimately, this will mean global insecurity in terms of democracies, and this might lead to destruction of many democracies around the world if they don't feel secure without US support, or they don't feel secure if they feel that the US won't support them anymore. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, looking at it from a broad perspective, we believe that the motion ultimately does more harm than good. Walk the opposition.
Today, all outside opposition attacks seem to lie on only one point of contention, which is, will Israel be wiped from the Middle Eastern map the moment we withdraw military US aid? Ladies and gentlemen, we feel that side opposition has failed to fundamentally contend with us on firstly improving America's image within the region. Secondly, they failed to recognize the importance of reaching a two-state solution, because ultimately what they seem to want as well is peace. I believe that two-state solution can bring about that peace that is truly long-lasting. So ladies and gentlemen, three main points of contention. First of all, the all-important opposition point of contention. Will Israel be wiped from the Middle East? Secondly, does Israel feel an existential threat? And so what if it does? And last of all, where do US interests truly lie? Because the US is an equal player in today's debate. So first of all, will Israel be wiped from the Middle East the moment we withdraw support? And I've looked at this point of contention in the two ways so you can understand it better. First of all, let's analyze the intent of both Israel and the Arabian nations to attack each other the moment we withdraw US support. Second of all, let's analyze the ability of them to do so. So now let's look at the intent, under which there are 2 points. First of all, let's talk about diplomacy. Now, the first speaker essentially ignored me when I raised the whole point of diplomacy. In other words, we believe the Arabian nations will continue to engage Israel with diplomatic measures the moment US withdraws military aid from Israel. So thank you, sir. We give you 2 reasons. First of all, it's easier to swallow. because it's ultimately much easier for your Arabian nations to negotiate with Israel when it no longer has the backing of the United States of America. And why is this so? Because negotiations cannot hope to occur when there's nothing to negotiate about. If one party holds all the cards, and in this case it is Israel, we believe that ultimately negotiations cannot occur. So assuming they listen to everything that they've said, assuming US military aid does cripple Israel that much, believe that it brings Israel down to the level of an Arabian nation, it will no longer be provocative, and instead, both nations have to consider each other as potential powers and therefore negotiate with each other. Second reason why intent, under the reason of intent, falls under the recent events of the Arab Spring, under which the two main opponents of Israel, Syria and Iran, will be dealt with here. So firstly, under Syria. Now, Syria is currently facing mass protests within the nation. President President Bashar al-Assad currently has been trying to suppress protests within Israel, and yet at the same time he cannot hope to attack Israel, given that Golan Heights, which is a strategic position captured by Israel, will ultimately be used against Syria itself if it wishes to wage war. And secondly, on Iran, we think that Iran is a rogue nation within the Middle East that's more often than not sprouted out its mouth to know truth. And we believe that Iran has gone on and on declaring to declare that it will not recognize Israel and so on and so on. Ultimately, we haven't seen Ahmadinejad truly follow up with substantial policy. And last of all, Iran similarly faces the student protests 2 years ago. And ultimately, Iran, in regards to the recent Arab Spring, is unlikely to focus its attention on Israel for now. So the reasons why Israel will not attack them is simply because, as they pointed out, symbolism. More than anything, the symbolism of not having the strongest superpower in the world backing you anymore after it has done so for so many decades makes Israel less cocky. And ultimately, this will reduce its ability to wage war. So let's talk about ability here, right? So first of all, let's identify what's the real threat. Right from first speaker, we characterize the real threat as Hamas, as Hezbollah, not organized militaries, but non-organized terrorist groups. Ultimately, the ability of Israel to defend itself from these nations does not rely on conventional military. We gave a good analysis in our first speaker. How effective can a bomber possibly be against elusive targets? We think that ultimately, the kind of hardware that the US provides to Israel are war-waging in nature, not terrorist fighting. The way to fight terrorists, in fact, more often than not, comes from a battle of hearts and minds. We believe that the way to engage these terrorists is for Israel to combat them, or to combat their ability to gain soldiers from them. And we also elaborated on this in our first speaker, right? We talked about how US is the biggest banner of support for recruitment of terrorists into Hamas and Hezbollah. The moment we combat this threat without using conventional military, but instead appealing to the US, appealing to these people, to the common sense of these people, that the US is no longer the biggest poster boy for Israel, ultimately we believe the recruitment drive of terrorists will fail. Now that we have dealt with this, let's talk about Israel's ability to wage war. We believe that when the latest technology like the F-35 bombers are taken away, Israel will no longer be able to launch preemptive strikes. And note that word preemptive, because ultimately Israel has been rather paranoid. And this leads me on very nicely to my second main point of contention. Does Israel feel an existential threat? And so what if it does? Because Israel, if you look at President Netanyahu's speech in Congress recently, likes to paint itself as constantly under threat. It constantly worries about its survival. But frankly speaking, how well have they substantiated this survival? So let's look at what Israel has been behaving, how Israel has been behaving so far. We don't think that waging wars against Lebanon, waging wars against the Gaza Strip and firing missiles against them, we don't think such actions are symptomatic of a nation that's ultimately worried about pissing other nations off. We believe that Israel has been, on the whole, aggressive against the Arabian nations, and even if they do feel a threat, we don't think aggression is a solution to this. We don't think aggression is a solution to this problem. Secondly, Israel has extended settlements with impunity, right? Regardless of what President Obama has done to impose some sort of 100-day stoppage on the expansion of settlements, Israel has completely blatantly ignored their greatest ally in this matter and forged on ahead without any regard whatsoever for the Middle Eastern situation on the ground. We don't think Israel, even if it does feel an existential threat, behaves in a manner befitting of a nation and experiencing an existential threat. And therefore, Israel cannot be condoned in this situation. We also like to point to you the rise of the moderates and pacifists within Israel. We believe that the people within Israel are tired of decades and decades of hearing of this existential threat that's supposedly haunting them. We believe that the people of Israel ultimately recognize not through military force, but but instead through realizing, through self-determination, through getting some sort of economic foothold, and ultimately recognizing their place in Palestine. We believe that such policies have worked in Palestine, and ultimately such policies don't seem to threaten Israel outright politically. And therefore we believe, as what my second speaker told you in his substantive, and was never rebutted, when the rise of moderates and pacifists in Israel can come about, we think that ultimately Israel will be unable to take a hardline stance and turn insular like what side opposition will paint them to be. So last point of contention, where do US interests lie? Now, they talk to us about democracy. But we think democracy has an end goal. The end goal is the protection of human rights. The right to vote, and especially the right to life and not to be discriminated against. No matter what Israel talks about and what Netanyahu painted in his speech about how Israel grants Israel and Palestine equal rights, polls within the country, as well as factual accounts within the country, seem to suggest otherwise. Palestinians are second-class citizens within Israel, and maybe not even that. Palestinians are discriminated against by the police, have to go under stricter border checks, and so on and so forth. Palestinians are denied the rights that they have within this democracy they call Israel. We think that ultimately, the second speaker's substantive is easily dealt with. The US will abandon badly behaving democracies. It will not support any democracy that claims to champion democracy, but ultimately this democracy seems to be self-serving. We believe that America ought not to be complicit in Israel's murder and systematic murder of innocent people living in the Gaza Strip and Lebanon. And ultimately, the Arab Spring, the usefulness of Israel as a satellite state is diminished. US interests lie in gathering other allies, such as a new Egypt, for instance, on its side. Israel is not vital to the survival of the United States, but we believe that the Middle East ought to cooperate in order for it to do so. Good side.
So this debate comes down to whether or not aid from the US should stop from going to Israel. And so this debate ultimately went through many aspects. Ultimately, it's classified into two main areas. Firstly, and a really sticky issue in today's debate, will Israel be vulnerable to hostile nations? Should US aid stop? And secondly, the second real issue was the public image of the USA and the result and the consequences and the result of deterioration as a result of the motions of hostility. So let's talk about whether Israel will be vulnerable to hostile nations. Now, essentially, the main idea brought by that side was the idea of a nuclear deterrent. How Israel somehow has nuclear deterrent, and as a result, no nation can want to attack it because nuclear bombing won't be rained down over Israel. And we gave you examples of how even though this nuclear policy, this nuclear weaponry has been developed since the 1960s, you still get wars in 1964, 1969, and 1973. And in 1973, even with this nuclear power, even with US aid, Israel nearly fell to Arab forces. And furthermore, even concession by their part, when they said that Iran was a rogue nation, let's not forget that Iran also has nuclear weaponry. So this evens the balance because Israel won't want to throw a nuclear bomb at Iran if they'll get thrown, they want to get thrown right back to them. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, they say that other nations are, busy doing other things, how they don't want to attack Israel at the present moment. But, we already showed you how hatred runs really deep when it comes to Arab nations and Israel. And ultimately, this weakness or the US withdrawal aid will mean that it's a prime time opportunity for them to attack and reclaim the territory. And furthermore, they said that Israel has the strongest military in the Middle East, and ultimately this will mean a greater deterrent to other countries trying to invade it. But let's look at this carefully, ladies and gentlemen. Israel is one country. Let's sum up all of the Arab states and let's see whether all the Arab states combined in their mission to try and attack Israel will mean that Israel's military will be able to overcome them. We don't think so. Because ultimately, all the Arab states combined as military and combined in their hatred in trying to destroy Israel and get back in their rightful territories, we say we will overcome Israel. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, is it that Israel has no weaponry that's high-tech, or there's no real technology after the US aid to use it? And my third speaker already talked about this by saying that existing weaponry that's already high-tech within Israel will still continue to be there. And ultimately, at the present moment, when the US aid leaves Israel, ultimately what will happen is that Israel wants to preemptive strike because this weapon will remain high-tech only for a short period of time. And they want to make full use of this technology in order to overcome possible hostile nations who will attack them in the future. So ultimately, it's only going to lead to more hostilities, both by Israel attacking its allies and Israel attacking Arab nations and Arab nations attacking Israel. And let's talk about the public image of the USA. Now, ultimately, the USA is seen as a bastion of democracy. And if the US abandons mentioned earlier in my standard point, it will mean an even bigger drop in public opinion than the existing ones about the atrocities being committed by Israel that is apparently being supported by the USA. And ultimately, it's other democracies who are also supported by the US also feel quite insecure because they don't think that the US will support them in times of need. That when the enemies surround them, the US will just abandon them. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be never really got to terms at this point. They never really understood the implications of the US withdrawing aid and how the public perception will be even more severely weakened as a result. And furthermore, ladies and gentlemen, they talk about human rights violations in Israel. We're already talking about Arab nations have even greater propensity of human rights violations. And if they were to take over Israel, this human rights violation will only increase. And if that's what Proposition 1 is, then let them have it. But we inside opposition think differently. We think the long term, we think the public perception of the US, we think that Israel is extremely vulnerable to the US without the US aid. And ultimately, as a result, we firmly believe that side opposition has their penalty.
We'd like to invite side proposition into the reality of the Middle Eastern politics and how things work here. We would like them to realize that despite the fact that only Egypt and Jordan recognize Israel as a sovereign nation, all the other Arab nations have not done the same thing. We'd like them to realize this and realize that whenever America or Israel tries to extend the hand of diplomacy to the Arabs shows them a fist, or vice versa. And having brought them to this reality of the world, we wanted to realize that Israel is the state of vulnerable military threats from the Arab nations and thus needs the continued support of America in terms of military and economic aid to survive as a nation as well as for the stability of the Middle East. I have 4 main questions for side opposition of this debate. Now, firstly, my first question is whether or not their policy is the best in stopping conflict in the Middle East. Secondly, the question of self-defense of Israel. Thirdly, the question of American condonation of Israeli aggression. And lastly, the question of America's image in the global world. Now, moving on to the first question of stopping conflict in the Middle East. Now, as I said, we have to realize the relationship between Israel is not one of just political hatred, but also historical and cultural hatred. They have been fighting each other since as far back as the Crusades. As far back as the Crusades, they have been killing each other and fighting every opportunity to fight each other for a very long period of time now. And in the modern era, they have fought 5 different wars and countless disagreements and insurgent battles. And because of that, we must realize that diplomacy, although it might help, is not the best way to solve the Middle Eastern conflict. Now, we would like to say that the United States aid we would like to say that the United States aid Israel is actually helping to keep the conflict in the Middle East from escalating to something even worse. The United States, if they withdraw their aid from the USA, from the Israelis, will see it as the abandonment of themselves as a protector of peace. Now, thank you. Now, the United States gives a lot of these military aid to Israel, and because of this, Israel feels itself strong and secure, and thus feels dependent against the Arabs. But however, what happens once you remove this military aid? The Arabs will take advantage of the weakness of the slave and attack them. Now, thank you. Now again, we must realize that the Arabs and Israelis have taken every opportunity in the last 2,000 years to try to exterminate each other as much as possible. And we feel that if the moment that the Israeli state loses its ability to protect itself, protect itself, the Arab nations will strike. They have done that in 48, 56, 73, and 69. And we don't see why they won't do it in 2011 or 2012. No, thank you. And as such, we see U.S. presence in giving this military aid and keeping Israel strong as the best way to keep peace. Because the moment this military aid is moved, the Arab nations will jump at the chance to invade Israel and take over its land. Because they have long-standing disputes such as the Golden Heights, West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. No, thank you. And many other reasons to take over Israel. At best, Israel will become a run state and have to comply with Arab orders. At worst, full-on scale military war. And as they have said, Israel is more than willing to use its nuclear power as a way to stop them. And in such a case of a war where they fight, where they might lose, they will use nuclear weaponry to invade. If they're willing to do preemptive strikes and many other things, there's no saying that they won't use nuclear weaponry. Now, moving on to the question of self-defense. Now, as I said, they say that
Point of information.
no, thank you. Now they say that Israel has the ability to defend itself due to its high-tech technology and good army, and because of it, they are not, and also they nuclear weaponry, and because of that, they are not, they no longer need the United States aid to protect themselves from the very obvious Arab threat. Now,
Point of information.
no, thank you. Now, we would like to defend the continuation of American aid to Israel based on the fact that without this military aid, they will become weak. Firstly, they mentioned about long-range high-tech missiles that can sent to Israel to help them protect it. They say that as these are for long-range striking from inside the country, they will no longer be needed if Israel pursues the case of self-defense. We would like to say that when you fight a war, if it's the case of the self-defense, after, for example, let's say the 1973 war, after Egypt invaded into Israel, almost got into Jerusalem, the Israelis pushed them back. And you know what they did to make sure that the Egyptians remained weak? They pushed into Egypt. And thus they require these long-range missiles to continue the war to make sure that the Egyptians, the Syrians, or Lebanese, or whatever, can no longer harm them. This is why these long-range military missiles, as well as other important American technology, given to Israel, is important, vital for the sake and security of Israel. Don't you agree, sir?
Hamas is the greatest threat to Israel. Tell me how an F-35 helps Israel fight Hamas.
On Hamas, firstly, you said that disorganized rebels that actually attack Israel. I would like to say that if disorganized rebels can attack Israel and commit so much trouble to Israel, I'm saying that when organized states attack, organized states such as Syria and Egypt attack them, it'll be even worse. And the thing is that you seem to underplay the ability of bombing nations to actually strike out insurgents to invade places where they hide, as well as also in modern armies. Now, moving on to the question of American condemnation of Israel's aggression. Firstly, they mentioned about the radicals in Israel. What I'd like to say, there's a reason why they're called radicals. They're extremists. They are the far end of the political scale, which means very little people actually listen to them. That's why they call them radicals. Otherwise, we'd call them moderates. I mean, in Saudi Arabia, the moderates push for Sharia law. To me, that's quite conservative, even evil. Now, and because they are radicals, they do not really have much of a voice in this political government. Sure, if you take away US support, they will become even less weak. But then again, since they don't prove as a threat in the first place because they are extremist radicals, I don't see why this is a good reason to take them out in the first to take all military support out. And secondly, they say that Israel is continuing its act of aggression, expansionism under the eyes of the United States in terms of approval. Now, we'd like to tell them to restudy their history. In 1985, Israel, in a matter of goodwill and peace, returned the Sinai Peninsula back to the Egyptian government. And then in 1999, they withdrew from Lebanon despite the fact that there is continued threat to them by Hamas. You know what? And also in 2001, they had further diplomacy with the PLO to come up with a basic form of agreement to come up with. What does these actions in the last 20-30 years tell me? They tell me that Israel is not pursuing an action of aggressive expansionism. They're showing a more willing to work with nations and give them back. However, usually these Arab nations do not respond favorably to it. Aside from Egypt and Jordan, what other Arab nations recognize it? How can you have diplomacy with a country that refuses to recognize your word exists? Lastly, on the question of American image, as I said, without American support in the Middle East, Israel's state will crumble, and then there will be huge war and possibly even nuclear disaster in the Middle East. How can America say it's a protector of peace if it's willing to let something like this happen? I say the America is a protector of peace if it continues to support military aid to the Israelis. I would do a dance of confidence to say that it is much better for America to continue aid to the Middle East rather than have it taken away. As with that, I say go with side opposition.
Request of side opposition that they actually oppose our case. So the tragedy of this debate was that the only actual opposition to the distinct lines of logic we ran came in that third speaker and their reply speaker. Otherwise, they focused almost exclusively on the question of Israel's survival, with every last point of theirs going back to this question. Let's demonstrate how not only did we win the argument that Israel will survive, we also captured our distinct lines of logic that still stand despite the late advances of that third speaker and reply speaker. This debate is fundamentally about survival and about progress. So let's begin with the question, will Israel survive? Side opposition's only real point. They told us Arabian nations will attack Israel because they did so 5 times in recent history. They ignored our analysis about how, in fact, progress toward peace has been made in the Arab region. In fact, if you look at the numbers, all of those wars which the Arabian nation launched against Israel happened a really long time ago. They were spaced approximately 10 years apart, and we haven't seen them for 40 years. We haven't seen a movement toward aggression by these so-called belligerent nations. So their understanding of these Arab nations is fundamentally simplistic. But we told you that other threats exist, which I'll get to later. We told you that Iran's rhetoric about how they want to wipe Israel off the map is empty rhetoric, because they never actually did it. We told you about how each one of those 5 wars was won by Israel, so they're not in fact likely to try it again when Israel has such a fantastic track record of winning these wars despite the combined power of the Arab nation. For this reason, we don't think Arabian nations are going to strike. But even if we do, they beg an important question. Will the withdrawal of US aid affect Israel's survival chances? Glendon told you all the way from Birth Prop that US aid aids offensive material, not defensive material. And the only time they actually responded to this was in that third figure, when he said, we need to push Egypt all the way back into Egypt before we can ensure that peace is, and we can have peace in the region. Well, no, what they're essentially saying is we need to invade other countries to ensure there's peace. This isn't how it works. In the status quo, we can ensure peace by deterring other countries from offensive action, and the withdrawal of US aid isn't going to change that. But over and above that, the reply speaker finally made a rebuttal that the combined militaries of Egypt can defeat them, ignoring my first speaker's substantive material about how Israel does produce its own high technology. It produces the Merkava tank, it produces the Nimrod missile, 2 examples of how it does have technological advances. This analysis was ignored entirely by side opposition. So even if the Arabian nations will attack Israel, the withdrawal of aid doesn't affect Israel's chances. And so we want the big issue that really made at the heart of this debate. Let's look at the other issue. Slightly smaller because side opposition spend less time on that. Second question, will we see progress in Israel's conduct? So they said that because Israel feels safe in the status quo, it will not be aggressive in its action. They only rebuttal to this point. Our response is simple. Explain all of the aggressive action that Israel has made in the past. Explain this action because this action evidently shows that Israel doesn't really care. And we talked about how we empower the moderates and disempower the radicals. And he didn't have a response to this line of analysis. And so all of these effects contribute to the third question on whether or not we see progress in Middle East stability. Side proposition stood for the 2-state solution for Israel and Palestine. We stood for America's ability to intervene in the Middle East as a mediator after it stops implicitly condoning Israel's action. We talked about disempowering terrorists by removing the rhetoric they use to fuel their cause. All of this came up in my first speaker and has never been touched by side opposition. That's how we contribute to Middle Eastern stability. But we've got a final question. Will the United States principles survive? Because we told you that the United States cannot stand by a party which acts in an aggressive, belligerent, and inhumane manner. Their only response was, well, democracies around the world now feel that they're not supported. Fine, we don't support democracies which commit such flagrant atrocities, because that isn't the principle that the United States stands by, not the principles which we want to stand by.
Remain in the news, a number of issues that affect the world's global geopolitical system. And it was quite interesting to sit back and think about what would be the effect if the United States were to change its stance, something that has had a significant effect on the Middle East region for the last several decades. A number of things judges take into consideration as we decide which team have won these debates. We're looking firstly at the speaker's speaking style, their public speaking skills, their ability to engage us, and reach out to us as an audience. We're looking at the strategic elements, how well each member has fulfilled their role, how well they've worked together as a team, how effectively they structured and prioritized their arguments, as well as the content of their arguments, how well they've developed, analyzed, and selected the points they made. In terms of style, I think we saw 6 very effective public speakers speaking today, all of whom had a number of interesting things to say and were quite engaging and interesting to listen to. The other thing I would say with relation to style that would have been nice to see in this debate is this is quite a large lecture theatre. We do have some people sitting fairly near the back. We did feel a few of the speakers seemed to be focused largely on the front few rows. where perhaps because they felt the most important people were there, I don't know. But it would have been nice to see some of the speakers really making an effort to take in everybody, even the people at the back. We're all part of the audience. It's important to persuade all of us as judges. That's something we think about. But on the whole, we thought the style in this debate was very good. Strategically, what was very good about this debate was that both teams' cases, and indeed all the individual speeches, were very nicely structured. All the speeches were very easy to follow. We got a sense of what they were talking about at the beginning. They moved nicely, and from one point to the next, it was very easy to follow the line of argument, and that really helped us follow the debate. And all the speakers seemed to know what they were doing. They were working too well together as a team. Every speaker knew their role, as you would expect from a team at this stage in the competition. In terms of content, there were a number of arguments which went backwards and forwards between the teams. It was good to see that the teams were very clearly listening to each other, very clearly responding to exactly what the other teams had said, not just the arguments they thought the other team might have come up with before the debate. And in the end, we felt there were some fairly good attempts to rebut all the other key points from the other team. Perhaps a couple of the rebuttal arguments were left a little late in the debate. There were some points that were raised, largely forgotten about for a speech or two on the other side, and then raised again towards the end of the third speeches and the reply speeches. So it would have been nice to see teams reacting to some of the most key points a little bit earlier, a little more timely in the debate. But in the end, we think most of the points were responded to, and the teams really were engaging each other, as well as indeed through very regular use of points of information in the debate. All the speakers were well engaged in those. So what were the key issues of this debate? Well, there was the argument about whether or not the withdrawal of the USA would be a genuine, serious threat to Israel, to its sovereignty, to its survival. And there were arguments that went backwards and forwards between the teams. We were told, on the one hand, by the proposition that the nature of the situation today is that Israel is not under such direct and immediate threat. We were told by the opposition that in fact they indeed were. And there were a number of historical examples we could look at where Israel had come under attack and possibly come fairly close to being defeated. And of course the proposition came back and said, well, these are rather historical, not really up to date. If we look at the present situation where the threats really come more from insurgents rather than other nations who tend to engage more in rhetoric than real attacks, maybe there's not so much of an issue. But the teams batted this argument backwards and forwards between each other over the course of the debate. There was an argument that Israel may move towards a more aggressive stance if it feels that it hasn't got USA. We were told by the opposition that knowing that some of their high-tech military equipment coming from the US was going to become obsolete very soon, they might feel the need to use it quickly rather than allow it to become obsolete. But we were told by the proposition that in fact it would probably make them moderate their stance a little bit more rather than being more aggressive, knowing that they didn't have this backing. Again, the two teams batted this backwards and forwards. One rather interesting argument that came up from the proposition side was how it's going to affect negotiations between Israel and other Arab countries in terms of pushing towards the peace. Will this in fact put them on a more even playing field with the Arab nations? I mean that they're more likely to compromise and come to some sort of negotiated settlement. And that one we didn't really hear much of a response to coming from the opposition, although it could have been pushed a little bit harder by the proposition too, because it was quite an interesting point that came up and then just sort of seemed to die in the debate after it first came up. And we also had some arguments going backwards and forwards about moderates versus radicals within Israel. We were told by the proposition that it's going to embolden the moderates and set back the radicals who feel that currently that because of US support they can take this radical stance. But this was reasonably effectively countered by the opposition, who told us a little bit about how in fact these radicals don't necessarily have as strong a say as being made out within Israel, and in fact the moderates may in fact become more involved and may be more emboldened by knowing that there's US support, and therefore there's always a backup plan. So a number of arguments went backwards and forwards. In the end, as judges, we have to decide which team has been most consistent, both in terms of setting up with some really detailed, substantial quality of arguments at the beginning of the debate, and have really spent some time attacking every tier of the other team's case later on in the debate and tying it all together nicely through the third and reply speeches. And the judges were not unanimous about which team won. It was a split decision among our panel of 5 judges, 4-1. So although a majority of the judges thought one team had won, doubt was cast for one adjudicator to see it the other way. But in the end, a majority of the adjudicators thought that one team had been more consistent in establishing its case and responding to what the other team had said throughout the debate, whereas the other team did so effectively at times, but not quite as consistently through the whole of the debate. So in the end, only one team wins. But it was a good debate, a close debate. Both teams did very well. Thank you very much for what was a good grand final. And you will find out which team has won and who the best speaker was in a little bit.